This playlist collects together and organizes the individual component modules, which together will comprise our lecture on Dennett's article, Why You Can't Make a Computer That Feels Pain, and we'll discuss in some detail whether or not Dennett should have named the article Why You Can't Make a Computer That Feels Folk Pain, or perhaps Why You Can Make a Computer That Feels Pain. We'll begin by discussing the Hilarian dilemma of the eliminativist. Then we'll outline the two explicit lines of argument that Dennett uses in the context of this paper. I call the first line of argument the multiple masters argument, and I refer to the second line of argument as the wedges of contingency argument. We'll finally end the lecture by looking at Dennett's view about the relative position of our folk theory in light of the eliminativist concerns that are raised in the context of this paper. As we noted in the first lecture on eliminative materialism, eliminative materialists argue that folk or pre-theoretic conceptions of mental phenomenon constitute a theory for predicting, explaining, and manipulating mental phenomenon that is and ought to be realistically interpreted. This folk theory, however, proves woefully inadequate considered on its own merit. Moreover, far more sophisticated theories now exist for prediction, explanation, and manipulation, theories that exhibit superior power, promise, and purview. Thus, the eliminativist concludes that we ought to set aside the concepts and schemas of our folk theory in favor of the concepts and schemas of these new theories. Thus, as we've discussed, the eliminativist position turns both upon evaluating the merit of folk theories in themselves and on the relative comparison of merits between folk theories and contemporary theories. Thus, much of the argumentative force of their position relies upon revealing inadequacies in folk theories, paired with an explication of the corresponding accounts of such phenomenon within contemporary neuroscientific and/or computational frameworks. Herein lies the catch-22 of the eliminative materialist's position. The most forceful case for elimination introduces more specialized and detailed information than the typical reader can likely process. In other words, their best arguments invoke a depth of knowledge and amount of information that tends to render their points opaque and obscure. Given the Hilarian dimensions of the eliminativist dilemma, I've opted for adopting the quixotic task of attempting to outline the underlying logical and structural relationships in Dennett's paper in a manner that strips them of the descriptive and theoretical details that might render them opaque or obscure to students. The goal is to help students understand the essential logic of the position and then allow them to go back and consult Dennett himself for the details that might make the argument more forceful. With those prefatory caveats out of the way, let's go ahead and consider Dennett's argument. Dennett offers up two explicit lines of argumentation in support of his view. The substance of his overarching argument in this article is that one cannot build a computer that feels pain for two reasons. On the one hand, our ordinary notion of pains has a diverse set of explanatory and regulatory goals. Call this the multiple masters argument. As a result, the concept of pain isn't merely subservient to the goal of creating a predictive, explanatory, and manipulative theory. It has ethical dimensions, it has anthropocentric dimensions, and so on. On the other hand, the collection of intuitions that constitute our ordinary notion of pain are inconsistent with each other and with the neurophysiological facts. Call this the wedges of contingency argument. One can locate the multiple masters argument in statements like the one that he gives us on page 422. One reason why you can't make a computer that feels pain is that our concept of pain is not a pure psychological concept, but also ethical, social, and parochial. Indeed, the multiple masters argument represents a divergence between Dennett and the Churchlands, for instance. Both Dennett and the Churchlands seem to accept the Salesian claim that scientific discourse is but a continuation of a dimension of discourse present in human discourse from the very beginning, expressing the descriptive ontology of everyday life. But while the Churchlands see folk theories as pure explanation and prediction tools. Dennett follows Davidson and construes them as having a wider and often conflicting scope. Indeed, the multiple masters argument understands folk theories as invoking conceptual schemes and adopts Davidson-style arguments against interconceptual reduction, like the ones that we saw when we looked at mental events. In short, the multiple masters argument suggests that folk theories cannot rival the predictive, manipulative, and explanatory prowess of neuroscientific theories, in part because their very conceptual nature places limits upon their capacity to achieve the pure descriptive functionality that comes so naturally to neuroscientific categorizations. In the next lecture module, we'll turn our attention from the multiple masters argument towards the wedges of contingency argument.